Hello again. This is one of the 250 talks on the history of Western art, from cave art to the present day. So I hope that there is something here for everyone, so feel free to start where you like. This particular talk is from section 12 on Tudor and Stuart art, and it was actually inspired by an exhibition at the Royal Academy on Charles I, King and Collector. So what I do in this talk is I cover the development of collecting in Britain, the King's collection, and the manner in which it was sold during what's called the Commonwealth Sale. But let's start at the beginning with the sort of foundations of collecting. How did it all begin? There were a select number of Italian families, the Farnese, the Medici, the Gonzaga, the Borghese, and they created galleries of art in the late 1400s. I think inspired by splendour and magnificence. In Northern Europe, in the late 1500s, it started with an interest in creating a cabinet or room of curiosities, so they might contain natural history exhibits, geology, ethnography, archaeology, religious and other relics and works of art, and they were known as Wunderkammer or Kunstkammer, wonder rooms or art rooms. The most famous Kunstkammer was that of the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II, and it contained sculptures and paintings and, quote, curious items from home and abroad, antlers, horns, feathers, and other things belonging to strange and curious animals. But by 1600, the preeminence of classical statues was assured, but it wasn't until after 1600 that the esteem of paintings started to grow, which is my main interest in this talk. But even then, even during the 1600s, paintings weren't valued as highly as tapestries and plate and jewels. So this fashion for Wunderkammer, cabinets of curiosities, or room of wonders, slowly went out of fashion, and collecting paintings became the pursuit of the sophisticated. And this is a typical Northern European 17th century art collection belonging to Archduke Leopold William Habsburg, the governor of the Spanish Netherlands. And in 1647, David Tenier became court painter to the Archduke and keeper of his collection, and painted several of these gallery portraits. Excuse me. The Archduke is the one shown in this painting wearing a tall hat, and he's showing his visitors around his collection. Most of the collection was Venetian. Almost half of his paintings were by Titian, and the other Venetians were represented by Giorgione, Parma-Vecchio, Tintoretto, Bassano, Veronese, and he also had paintings by Holbein, Strozzi, Guido Reni and Rubens. The sculpture supporting the table is a bronze. Tenier himself is represented as the figure on the far left. Now, a collection like this, well, any collection, any purchase of a painting required connoisseurship, because there were so many copies, forgeries, and works by mediocre artists. And these experts, these connoisseurs, were those that were trusted to be able to identify genuine works of art. And art started to be appreciated based on its formal properties, its brushwork, style, composition, as distinct from the content, the subject matter. And that meant that sophisticated Protestant collectors could appreciate Catholic art without needing to believe in what it represented. And by 1626, the reputation of the artist had become the most important aspect of collecting in England. In other words, high prices were paid for big name artists. Now in England, Charles I, shown here, was the biggest collector. This painting is by Van Dyck, who shows Charles I on horseback as at an unprecedented scale and as a ruler, warrior and knight. Now, both artist and patron admired and collected works by Titian, but a more direct influence on this painting by Van Dyck was his master's Rubens' 1603 portrait of the Duke of Lerma, now in the Prado. Now, Charles I would have seen this painting on his visit to Spain as Prince of Wales in 1623, and it's interesting to compare the two. I think it shows how the naturalness and psychological depth of the portrait, the person shown, has become enriched over this 30-year period. Now, as I said, Charles I visited Spain in 1623, and he went there to woo the Infanta Maria, sister of Philip IV. He failed to become engaged because the Spanish insisted that the English convert to Catholicism. But he made purchases as he went along. He bought this painting, for example, Titian's Woman in a Fur Wrap, and he purchased it from a Spanish nobleman. Now, one of the difficulties was no one wanted to sell. The Spanish nobleman certainly didn't want to sell, but he was compelled to by Philip IV. Charles also obtained paintings as gifts from Philip IV, such as Titian's Pardo Venus, which we'll see later. It was an important picture in Philip IV's collection, but he had a very large collection. In fact, he had the largest group of works by Titian ever owned by a single individual, and his total collection, all the works, were over 2,000 paintings. Although Charles I acquired the biggest art collection in England, the first and most intellectual art collector was Thomas Howard, who became known as the father of art collecting, and they were both part of what was known as the Whitehall Group, or sometimes the Whitehall Circle. And this consisted of the King, Charles I, as shown here, Thomas Howard, George Villiers, Philip Herbert and William Herbert, and James Hamilton. They were the members of the Whitehall Group. Now, Charles's collection was over 1,500 paintings. Thomas Howard, 500 to 700. Buckingham, 300. And Hamilton, 600. And also there were many other minor collectors. As we'll see, when Charles was executed, all of these collections flooded onto the market. Although Philip and William Herbert became parliamentarians and kept their collection. So let's look at the members of the Whitehall Group. This, of course, is the most important member, Charles I, but the other one that I've mentioned is Thomas Howard, Earl of Arundel. He started collecting in the early 17th century. Of course, wealthy Italian families have been collecting since the 15th century. And Henry VIII and Elizabeth had portraits of monarchs and important events. They were painted to enhance their personal magnificence, but the most prestigious items by far were the tapestries that they purchased and hung on their walls. This is a well-known portrait of Thomas Howard, known as the Collector Earl, and on the right his wife, Alethea, who was also an art collector, and both were art connoisseurs. Now in 1613 to 14, Arundel and Alethea paid an extended visit to Italy in the company of Inigo Jones and 34 other attendants. And in Venice, they were joined by Sir Dudley Carleton, who was ambassador to Venice. And when the Countess Alethea inherited a third of her father's estate when he died, they were able to pursue their passion for collecting art without limit almost. They collected statues, they collected paintings, they collected engravings, and this portrait painted by Daniel Meitens shows you them in front of their art collection in their house, their sculptures and their picture gallery. When the Civil War started, they fled abroad, and their collection was slowly dispersed because they needed to sell their collection to support themselves. But when he died, he still possessed, or his family possessed, 300 to 400 paintings, including 44 works by Holbein, together with sculptures, books, prints, drawings, antique jewellery, and so on. Most of his marble carvings, known as the Arundel marbles, were eventually left to the University of Oxford. This is a painting by Anthony van Dyck of George Villiers and his wife Lady Catherine Manners, shown as Adonis and Venus. Of the members of the Whitehall group, it was George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, that was closest to Charles I. And Buckingham and Arundel had the only collections to rival the king's. Buckingham had 300 paintings, Rubens, Caravaggio, Titian, Tintoretto, Bazzano, and they were all looked after by his trusted agent, Balthazar Gerbier. Now, the Duke of Buckingham, George Villiers, started as the lowly son of a country gentleman, but he was very handsome and found favour with the bisexual James I, and he was rapidly showered with honours until he became Duke of Buckingham. Or he was actually assassinated in 1628 by a disgruntled army officer. The painting here was 1620. It shows Buckingham as Adonis, the ever-youthful god, who represented the cycle of birth, death and rebirth. It was inspired by Titian's Venus and Adonis and by Shakespeare's poem Venus and Adonis, which had been published some years before, about 1592 to 3, and that in turn was based on Ovid's Metamorphoses description of Venus and Adonis. And we know from the poem that Venus seizes Adonis as he's about to go hunting, and Shakespeare writes, "Backward she pushed him as she would be thrust, and panting he lies, and breatheth in her face." And Venus tells him, "Be bold in play, our sport is not in sight." But Adonis is keen to go hunting, and she can't stop him, although she has a foresight that he will be killed, and he is killed in a hunting accident. It's possible that Shakespeare had actually seen a copy of Titian's Venus and Adonis. Van Dyck shows them strolling together, and there's no hint here of the death of Adonis. As I said, the woman next to him is his wife, Catherine Manners, Duchess of Buckingham. And incidentally, it was acceptable, if shown as a mythological figure, for a woman to be bare-breasted. because in this context it represents virginity. Incidentally, one biographer wrote that she was one of the few women of rank of the time whose gentleness and womanly tenderness, devotion and purity of life were conspicuous in the midst of the almost universal corruption and immorality of the court. No scandal was ever breathed against her name. I thought I'd show you another picture of them, and also of the King and Queen. This is by Honthorst, and you can see it today above the Queen's staircase at Hampton Court. On up top left is Charles I and the Queen Henrietta Maria. They represent Apollo and Diana on the clouds. And then looking up towards them is the Duke of Buckingham as Mercury, and his bare-breasted wife as Grammar. Grammar, which was the leading liberal art, is holding a key and a book, and is leading all the others out of a dark cave that you can see on the right. And if you look through them, look behind Catherine Manners, and you'll see Logic holding scales, Rhetoric with a scroll, Astronomy with the armillary sphere and dividers, Geometry with a globe and dividers, Arithmetic with a tablet, and Music with a lute. Note that Astronomy has a black attendant holding a crossstaver, which was a navigational instrument. And on the left, there are attendant children driving off envy and possibly hate or ignorance with the torch of knowledge and a trumpet of fame, while another child drives away a goat representing bestial appetites that keep one from studying. From the 1630s, Van Dyck's fame was increasing rapidly, but there were many paintings commissioned from other artists, lesser known but very competent artists, like this Dutch painter Honthorst. Now, I mentioned earlier about the difficulty of purchasing because few wanted to sell. There were three main ways to acquire art. One was to commission it from the artist. Another was to receive it as a gift. It was quite a common form of gift. And another was to purchase it from an agent. And all the great collectors used agents to negotiate a purchase. It separated them from the money matters of the purchase, and also the agents were seen to be and were connoisseurs. They could recognise fakes. Now, all three ways were difficult because good artists were permanently busy satisfying the first way, receiving commissions from their existing patrons. Receiving gifts was, of course, unpredictable. You never knew when you might get a gift or what it would be. And purchasing was fraught with problems. There was people didn't want to sell. There was little market, and there was no way to authenticate a painting. George Villiers was the sort of opposite of Thomas Howard. He loved the aesthetic and bought impetuously and with flair. He did appoint the agent I mentioned, the unsavoury character Balthazar Gerbier, and he would tour Europe and find suitable paintings. He was the son of a Huguenot who had fled France. He was trained as a painter, but he was really skilled as a connoisseur. And in 1621 he went to Rome and managed to acquire Four Seasons by Guido Reni, and in Venice during the same trip he bought 11 pictures with the help of Sir Henry Wotton and the dealer Daniel Nice. The paintings included this one, which is why I'm showing it, Titian's Ecce Homo, for which he paid £275. It was painted for Giovanni d'Anna, a Flemish merchant who lived in Venice, and was probably started not long after he'd completed the Presentation of the Virgin. In many ways, a studied revision of his earlier work. This is William Herbert, a courtier and an important patron of the arts, painted by Daniel Meitens. He held office under both James I and Charles I. Ben Jonson and Inigo Jones benefited from his patronage, and it appears that he paid for Inigo Jones to tour Italy in 1605. And the first folio of Shakespeare's plays was dedicated to William Herbert. So he was a well-known figure in the Stuart art world. He was a bookish man, a heavy pipe smoker, which he said he smoked to keep his migraines at bay. His first wife came with a dowry of £3,000 when her grandfather died, but he wanted the money immediately, and negotiations fell through. So I think I just said wife. I meant fiancée, betrothed, and so he never actually married her because he wanted the money straight away. He had an affair with Mary Fitton, and she became pregnant. He admitted it but refused to marry her, and so he actually ended up in Fleet Prison for a while. She had a son who died. He was released from prison, and he married the dwarfish and deformed daughter of the Earl of Shrewsbury for her money. He then had an affair with his cousin, and they had 2 illegitimate children. And he is thought by some to be the fair youth mentioned in Shakespeare's sonnets that the poet Shakespeare urges to marry. We know Shakespeare had also been urged to marry the granddaughter of Henry Carey, the Lord Chamberlain, who ran Shakespeare's company, but Herbert refused. Maybe she didn't have a big enough dowry, I don't know. When he died in 1630, his title was inherited by his brother Philip Herbert, and they were both keen collectors of art. And then the final member of the Whitehall group was James Hamilton. He was a Scottish nobleman and military strategist, and he also shared an interest in art collecting with Charles I. And Daniel Meitens painted Hamilton in a similar pose. He was one of those who attended the Prince of Wales, as he was then in Madrid, with Buckingham during Charles's unsuccessful attempt to marry a Spanish princess. Although younger than the other members of the group, he did become a noted art collector. As I said earlier, between 1636 and 38, he acquired some 600 paintings, a record speed for building up his collection, which contain many masterpieces. For example, this one, Titian's Nymph and Shepherd, as well as Titian's Madonna and Child with St. Stephen, Bellini's Young Woman Holding a Mirror, Giorgione's Adoration of the Shepherds, Three Philosophers, Jerome and Morris, Tintoretto's Susanna and the Elders, and Veronese's Christ and the Woman with Issue of Blood, all now in the Kunsthistorische Museum in Vienna. Because when he died, many of his paintings went to Antwerp, and some of them can be seen in the background of the Tenier painting Views of the Archduke's Picture Gallery that we saw earlier. It was actually Hamilton's vacillating and ineffectual leadership that did great damage to Charles I during the English Civil War between the Royalists and the Parliamentarians. Hamilton was executed shortly after Charles I in 1649. Now, Daniel Maytens was the official painter. This is a portrait he made of Charles I and Henrietta Maria. But the English court had no great painters, I mean painters like Titian. So it was a big coup for Charles I when he retained Van Dyck. And I would like to explain the impact Van Dyck had on the British court by first showing you this portrait by Daniel Maytens, known in England as Daniel Maytens the Elder. This painting was intended for Somerset House to be hung over the withdrawing room over the fireplace. Henrietta Maria was repainted at the time, I think, that it was originally painted. So I think that was done by Maytens on the instruction of the king to make her look more like the Van Dyck portrait that we'll see in a moment. Now, by 1631, when this was painted, Charles had been in power for 6 years, established himself as an important collector of paintings, and that raised the status in England of painting substantially. And suddenly, the court, all of the courtiers, needed to be knowledgeable about art and artists. Now, Anthony Van Dyck had been in England briefly in 1620 to 21 during the reign of Charles I, but the visit was unsuccessful and he returned to Flanders a few months later. But in 1632, he was invited back by Charles I and recognised immediately. He was knighted a few months after he arrived. He was made principal painter in ordinary to their majesties. He was granted a pension of £200 a year, a gold chain, lodgings in Blackfriars, and he was also paid between £20 and £100 per portrait. Let's see why. This is Anthony Van Dyck's portrait of Charles I and his wife Henrietta Maria, painted in 1632, the year he arrived. He changed the standard. People would ask Van Dyck to glamorise them. Henrietta Maria, for example, was described as having long, thin arms, crooked shoulders and protruding teeth. In fact, when Sophia, the Electress of Hanover, first met Henrietta Maria when she was in exile in Holland in 1641, she wrote, "Van Dyck's handsome portraits had given me so fine an idea of the beauty of all English ladies that I was surprised to find that the Queen, who looked so fine in painting, was a small woman, raised up on her chair with long skinny arms and teeth like defence works projecting from her mouth." End quote. So you can see that Van Dyck did a good job in glamorising them. And within a few weeks of his arrival, he painted this portrait, and there are many versions of it. It was placed in Charles's bedchamber. One art historian described Maytens' portraits as a Punch and Judy show portrait compared to the three-dimensional Van Dyck. The laurel branch that Henrietta holds out is being exchanged. She is just taking it and holding a branch. It I think is myrtle, which is associated with love and marital fidelity. Note the old-fashioned ruff in the Maytens. Let me show you it briefly. This ruff, I meant, compared with this lace collar, which was the new fashion, and new soft collars came into fashion. In fact, this is the first instance of the new lace collar in a Van Dyck painting, and the fashion was brought in by Charles. He was made, as I said, principal painter. He was paid more, knighted within the year, and mitens became just one of the king's drawers. Now, Charles knew about all the leading continental painters, particularly artists like Titian and Raphael, and Van Dyck was in this league, and so it raised the status of England. He was a pompous sort of person. As I said, he got a gold chain that he would wear everywhere. He would also go around wearing a sword, which was one of the status symbols of the nobility, which he wasn't. His behaviour was that of a nobleman rather than an ordinary person. He wore rich garments. He would always travel around surrounded by his servants. And he wore silks, feathers, brooches, as I said, a gold chain everywhere that he went. Thus, clearly the status of artists was changing. This is another Van Dyck of Philip Herbert, the 4th Earl of Pembroke, with his family. Philip Herbert inherited the title and art collection on the death of his brother, the 3rd Earl, and he exceedingly loved paintings. He was a great patron of Van Dyck. He supported Parliament in the Civil War, so his collection remained more or less intact. It's now at Wilton House in Wiltshire. Let me tell you a little bit about what's going on here. It's quite a complex and large painting. It's about a wedding. The 15-year-old boy in scarlet is the Earl's oldest son, and he's about to marry the 12 or 13-year-old Mary Villiers, yes, daughter of the Duke of Buckingham, George Villiers, and she came with a dowry of £25,000. The Pembrokes actually hated the Buckinghams, but Charles I insisted on the marriage. That's the way it went in those days. Look at their hands. On the far right, the Earl's daughter with her husband, the Earl of Carnarvon. They are actually holding hands, although he was a gambler and notorious womanizer and a rake. So, but nevertheless, there is that sexual element to the hand gesture. Although she has, the Countess has her hands folded. She's looking out at us with a very stern face. You could say a face full of melancholy. She's his second wife. She gave birth to 2 sons, but both died. Represented by the angels above. The Earl rejected her. He's turning away. He had her virtually confined, and she had no contact with anyone in the family. This painting probably was assembled from individual sketches of the individual members of the family. Notice the Earl is holding a white stave. That's his staff of office of the Lord Chamberlain. His right hand is pointing to the bride-to-be, Mary Villiers, as if he was accepting her. And he's pointing towards her womb, signifying her role in life. Although the marriage contract, because of their ages, specifically stated they wouldn't sleep together for 4 years. The bridegroom is not even looking at her. In fact, no one, if you look at this painting, no one is looking at anyone else. And his hand gesture of the son reflects back towards himself. Next to his left is the younger brother Philip, and it was whispered at court that Mary Villiers, the bride-to-be, had fallen in love not with Charles but with Philip. But that love had been denied because the corporate merger of the 2 families couldn't allow it. That might, of course, explain his look, and notice his hand He's almost on his heart, and although I think he's looking above her, he's almost looking at her. On the left are the three young Herbert boys on the ground, gloriously alive with their hounds and their books. So the painting is full of uncertainty, fragility, sorrow, grief, but there's also beauty, ancestry, continuity. Within a year, Charles had died of smallpox. His widowed bride married the future Duke of Lennox and Richmond, another of the Pembroke family's long-standing enemies. The Pembroke's own marriage never recovered, and the family was split by the Civil War. The Earl of Carnarvon, the chap on the far right, was a royalist and was run through by a trooper at the First Battle of Newbury. The Earl himself was dismissed as Lord Chamberlain. He turned parliamentarian, and he ended his life as an MP, stripped of his titles, ridiculed and despised by all his friends and enemies alike. So Van Dyck has painted and preserved a fleeting moment in time. This is Charles I in three positions, and it was commissioned by Henrietta Maria, the Queen, in 1635. She wanted and commissioned a bust from Giano Lorenzo Bernini of her husband, but Bernini didn't want to travel to the English court, and this portrait painted by Van Dyck was to allow Bernini to create a likeness of the king without actually visiting and seeing the king. It's in some ways, I think it's the arrangement here. It's not the only three positioned portrait. There was one done by Lorenzo Lotto, portrait of a goldsmith in three positions. Although at the time this was painted, it was thought to be by Titian. We see here Van Dyck flaunting his power with painting. There's the melting figures, mobile features, brilliant highlights in the eyes, soft cloudy hair. It's the reasons that Bernini himself gave for preferring painting to sculpted portraiture. Now, Henry Maria paid for the completed bust in 1638 with a diamond ring valued at about £800, but the bust sadly was destroyed in the 1698 fire at Whitehall Palace. It had been displayed there for over 60 years. Van Dyck's painting fared better. It was kept by Bernini in Rome, exhibited at the Pantheon, and much admired by Roman painters. This is Raphael, the miraculous draught of fishes. Now, gold and jewellery had intrinsic worth, but of course a painting is just canvas covered with pigment, so intrinsically it has no worth. Its value lies in its execution, and increasingly its value was determined by the artist who produced it. Something that was fraught with problems, of course, because there were many forgeries, and also artists had large studios, and so a painting from the studio might not have been touched by the hand of the master at all. Now, as I said, it was hard to find someone willing to sell their works, but Charles and, in fact, the Whitehall group as a whole benefited from the 30 Years' War, which was 1618 to 1648, as during that war, many wealthy families needed to sell all or some of their possessions. It was initially a war between the Protestants and the Catholics, and it gradually developed into a more general conflict involving most of Europe. So lesson number one was, if a family ran into hard times, moved quickly when a masterpiece became available, and travel there and make an offer. Charles was an avid collector, and while still prince in 1623, he sent £700 to Genoa to buy 7 of the 10 cartoons made by Raphael. And Raphael made these cartoons in order to, as a blueprint for tapestries depicting the Acts of the Apostles, which were then to be installed in the Sistine Chapel. The cartoons were commissioned by Pope Leo X, and they were amongst the greatest treasures of the High Renaissance. They were painted by Raphael and his assistants, and they're full-scale designs for the tapestries. As I said, the lesson was to buy from those who desperately needed the cash. The more desperate, the better for the buyer. Now, Mantua was ruled by the wealthy Gonzaga family, but the main Gonzaga family died out, and there was a war between who would inherit. Mantua was sacked, the family was ruined, and they had to sell their art collection. This Madonna of the Rabbit is an oil painting by Titian, painted in 1530, and was the greatest art deal of the 17th century. It was acquired with the rest of the Gonzaga collection by Charles I in 1627, and it was brokered by his agent Daniel Nice, a Flemish merchant who lived in Venice and famous for brokering this deal. He was a rich merchant, and Charles agreed to pay £28,000. He only, in fact, transferred 18,000, leaving a shortfall of £10,000, which bankrupted Daniel Nice and Filippo Burlamacchi, the dealer and financier who had organised the sale. So this painting later was acquired by Cardinal Richelieu and Louis XIV, which is why it's now in the Louvre. It's signed Titianus F. Facit. It's named after the white rabbit held in Mary's left hand. The rabbit is a symbol of fertility, and because it's white, Mary's purity. This is Mantegna's Triumph of Caesar, which is the work that was to prove the undoing of Daniel Nice. He successfully negotiated the sale of the Gonzaga, or part of the Gonzaga collection, and was tempted to buy the Triumph of Caesar for Charles. But when payment for the sale wasn't forthcoming, Nice was forced into bankruptcy, as I said, and he spent the rest of his life in London trying to get paid. And this was typical of many of Charles's creditors, from tailors to grocers. They were never paid. On Charles's death, about £40,000 was owed, and Parliament devised a scheme to pay the creditors by selling all of Charles's worldly goods after he had been executed. And the Triumph of Caesar are a series of 9 large paintings created by Andrea Mantegna between 1484 and 1492 for the Gonzagas in Mantua. It shows a triumphal military parade celebrating the victory of Julius Caesar in the Gallic Wars. It was regarded across Europe as Mantegna's greatest masterpiece, and it remains the most complete pictorial representation of a Roman triumph ever attempted, and the world's largest metric area of Renaissance painting outside Italy. It was acquired by Charles I in 1629. It's now still in the royal collection, and it is at Hampton Court. I hesitated because part of it is being restored, and so there's only 2 of the 9 paintings that can be seen at Hampton Court at the moment. Hopefully soon the room that they're normally kept in will be restored and all 9 will return to Hampton Court. It was originally painted in the fragile medium of egg tempera and glue, which is why it hasn't survived too well. It's been restored a number of times, and that has in general damaged the painting more. The the Anthony Blunt, who at one stage was surveyor of the Queen's pictures, said the triumphs may be a ruin, but it's a noble one as noble as those of ancient Rome, which Mantegna was so deeply admired. Well, collecting became popular at court, and there were many minor collectors like Algernon Percy, 10th Earl of Northumberland. He had a collection of about 100 paintings, including some 20 Van Dycks. And he became a military leader who supported Parliament in the Civil War. His father, the 9th Earl, was implicated in the Gunpowder Plot and imprisoned in the Tower till 1621. Percy married the daughter of William Cecil, was made an admiral, then Lord High Admiral, and that's why Van Dyck shows him standing by an anchor. I'm sure when he was posing for this, he wasn't actually standing by an anchor. Van Dyck would quickly sketch a portrait so as not to take too much time of the member of the aristocracy he was sketching, and then a model would wear appropriate clothes to be sketched, and often the clothes were painted by his workshop. Now, Percy was a parliamentarian, as I said. He was the most senior member of the government opposed to the king. He visited the king at Oxford as a member of the Peace Party, but when they couldn't negotiate peace, he retired to his estate at Petworth in West Sussex. But he returned in 1643 and was a supporter of the new model army. In 1645, he was made guardian of the king's 2 children, and there was talk that he might be made king if negotiations with Charles failed. He actually opposed any talk of trying the king for treason. He protested at plans to sell the Duke of Buckingham's collection. Possibly he didn't want to lose them for himself, but he agreed with Parliament that he could take the pick of the pictures in lieu of the £360 that Parliament still owed him for the losses incurred during the war, and he walked away with 12 paintings, including Parma Vecchio, Andrea del Sarto and Adam Elsheimer. This was the best of the paintings. He took Titian's Cardinal George d'Armagnac and his secretary. And he retired eventually. Percy retired from active duties during the Commonwealth and re-entered politics. He became a member of the Privy Council when Charles II came to the throne at the Restoration. But I need to mention Charles was, of course, tried, convicted and executed for high treason on the 30th of January 1649. On the 24th of March, the same year, although technically at the time it was the following year, an act was passed regarding the sale of the goods of the late King, the Queen and the Prince of Wales. It was thought this would easily raise a fortune and pay off the King's creditors, which included, as I said, people like tailors, his servants, various suppliers, even grocers. and they thought enough would be left over to fund the Royal Navy to the extent of £30,000. Although looking back from a modern viewpoint, it was an act of incomparable folly. Now, they started by setting up 9 trustees to go around all of the palaces and draw up an inventory and value the goods. And in fact, it was a very detailed inventory, so a good job was done at that point. The total valuation price of the Commonwealth Sale of the paintings was set at £33,690, and all the king's goods were moved to Somerset House to be sold by 6 men known as contractors, but many of the goods, particularly paintings, were not treated well, were damaged in transit, which lowered their value. There were many problems with the sale. Not least, no one knew how to value the paintings, and in particular, there was no market. So if there's no one willing to buy any of the paintings, they, in a sense, have no value. One of the reasons was that some groups in England were already seeing the late king as a martyr, and also parliamentarians had executed or driven away into exile potential purchasers. The other potential buyers around Europe were the monarchs, but they were appalled by what had happened in England and didn't want to be seen to be benefiting from Charles's execution. However, they did actually want to buy the paintings, as we'll see in a moment. So most of the initial buyers were supporters of Parliament and speculators hoping to turn a quick profit by buying cheaply and then selling. And of those, Colonel William Webb and John Hutchinson went on an extraordinary buying spree. Colonel John Hutchinson, a veteran of the late Civil War, became the largest cash purchaser of the King's pictures. And he was actually part of the tribunal that had sentenced Charles. He bought this painting, Jupiter and Antiope, or the Pardo Venus, for £600. And this painting, Venus and the Organ Player, for £165. In total, he spent £1,349 on paintings, including the children of Charles I. And it was Hutchinson who turned out to be one of the most canny of those who bought to make a profit. This painting, Venus with Organ Player, was described as a very pretty picture that is esteemed as one of the best by Titian, which is a nude woman and a man playing the organ, life-size. And Hutchinson sold it to Teniers for £600. Remember, he paid £165, and we'll see later how much he received for the Pardo Venus. The other purchaser, Colonel William Webb, another parliamentarian, decided to play the market as well. He bought a number of paintings by Italian masters, including Tarquin and Lucretia by Titian. But the risks he took were considerable because he wasn't an art connoisseur and they were paying the evaluated price. The Fitzwilliam Tarquin and Lucretia was probably a commission by Philip II of Spain, and it remained in his collection until 1813 and was taken to France by Bonaparte after he'd taken the Spanish throne, and it had several then private owners, and that's how it ended up in the Fitzwilliam. There's a variant, the one on the right, now in Bordeaux, which was purchased by Lord Arundel in Venice in 1613. And it's the Bordeaux Tarquin and Lucretia that we believe was acquired by Thomas Howard, probably in 1613, as I said, but then given to Charles I, and it remained in the royal collection until 1649, when it was bought by Colonel Webb, who sold it to Cardinal Jules Mazarin in 1661. So sometime later, and it was Mazarin who gave it to Louis XIV, and it remained in the royal collection and became part of the collection in the Louvre and is now in Bordeaux. But is it genuine? Paintings are easy to copy. It's difficult to detect forgeries. Connoisseurship became vital. It's still not clear, but it's now assumed that both paintings were by Titian. One of his Webb's best-known purchases was this Van Dyck, Rinaldo and Armida, which was painted for Charles I in 1629 for £78. Now Webb paid £80, which suggests he knew the price that Charles had paid, and he acquired portraits of all the Tudor monarchs from Henry VII for just £15. He began to attend the sale every day and purchased a portrait of Charles and Henrietta Maria for £60, and the following day a painting by Giulio Romano for just £8. And in a few weeks he bought a total of 56 paintings for a staggering £1,302, as the basic average wage for a military officer was £15 a year. Webb was obviously acting on behalf of a private buyer or a consortium who didn't want to be identified, possibly a European monarch. Now, artists were keen buyers and were experts as well, but they didn't have much money. Remigius van Liemput was an assistant of Van Dyck, dabbled in the market and made a number of purchases, all below about £40. He bought 35 paintings and sculptures over a 6-month period, including Titian, Giorgione, Correggio and Andrea del Sarto, and he was able to acquire this painting, the equestrian portrait by Van Dyck of Charles I, with Monsieur de Saint-Antoine, the one we saw earlier. It was valued at £150, and he tried to sell it in Antwerp for 1,500 guineas, but the price was too high. In fact, it's possible he was trying to sell a copy of the portrait that he'd made himself. After the restoration in 1660, the painting was still with him, and it was recovered from him for Charles I through legal proceedings. It wasn't just the king's goods, by the way, that was sold, but all the Whitehall group, including most of the collections, but although not all of the collections of Buckingham, Arundel and Hamilton. One of the first collections to be sold was Buckingham's. Now, as I said, the Duke had been murdered by one of his captains in 1628, and his son, also George Villiers, the second Duke of Buckingham, was sent abroad in 1645. That's before Charles I was executed, and in his absence the Commons later attempted to seize his art collection. This was prevented by the Duke of Northumberland, and he sent 200 paintings in 16 packing cases to Amsterdam for George Villiers. From there they were sent to Antwerp, and over the next 18 months they were pawned and sold to raise money to maintain his family, who were living in exile. And through a complex series of transactions, they were sold in 1650 to Archduke Leopold William for 60,000 florins. And this painting by Teniers we saw earlier shows many of the paintings from the Hamilton collection that had just been acquired. At this time, the Duke of Hamilton had been executed in 1649, and in his will he named his brother William as his heir. So somehow William was able to escape to Holland and take about a third of the art collection with him, and the Archduke acquired some of those paintings. In the end, the Archduke acquired about 200 paintings from the Hamilton collection. By the 1630s, that's fairly early on, it was before the Civil War, before the execution of Charles I, Arundel was in financial difficulties, largely because of his harebrained scheme. He set up a scheme and founded a commercial company to exploit Madagascar, and it failed completely. Now, in 1641, he escorted Maria de Medici abroad, and even then he was selling drawings to pay his debts. When he got back to London, he sent 60 cases of his belongings abroad, and in 1642 he escaped with Henrietta Maria and died in 1645 in Parma, a broken man. But his wife survived him, and the collection was sold to support the family, and some of those paintings went to parliamentarians. In 1653, Arundel's grandson sought to sell the paintings to the French and Spanish ambassadors, but the youngest son sued the grandson and stopped the sale. An inventory was drawn up, and the agent of the Spanish ambassador bought 56 Venetian paintings straight away, including 8 Veronese. And the difficulty of making money from the sale is shown by Arundel's nephews, who bought some of the works to make money. They overpriced them, though, and sold none, and then they tried to sell them by lottery, but sold no tickets. Part of their collection was also bought for France, and the Everard Jabach bought masterpieces from the collection, including a number of Holbeins now in the Louvre, and like Anne of Cleves, William Wareham, Archbishop of Canterbury, and Sir Henry Wyatt. And he also bought this painting, Giorgione's or Titian's Concept Champêtre, or Fate Champêtre. The difficulty of making money is shown by all of these sales. The Arundel's nephews that I mentioned just now, who overpriced the work and sold none. I remember I said they set up a lottery. Well, that lottery included this painting by Titian, The Flaying of Marsyas, a very famous painting, but nevertheless they still sold no tickets for their lottery. And in the end, Bishop Karl von Liechtenstein bought it for a vastly reduced price for his palace in Czechoslovakia, and it's still in the Czech Republic. Returning to the main sale, the Commonwealth Sale of the King's goods. As I said, the Somerset House was used to hold all the King's goods. It was used as a showroom, but that didn't work. It was a failure. They could sell very few, except the ones that I've mentioned. So they set up a second attempt to pay off the creditors. They offered to give the creditors the paintings as a payment in kind. And so tailors and plumbers, grocers didn't want the paintings. They wanted cash. So they formed 14 syndicates known as dividends, headed up with someone who was charged with selling the paintings. And these syndicates then tried to sell the paintings. And in May 1650, it was clear that the first attempt at a sale was a complete failure. They only sold a quarter of the pictures for £7,700. Remember, the valuation of the inventory was over £33,000. There was pressure from the creditors. The creditors wanted their money. So the Commons appointed a committee to try and expedite payment. And the creditors were paid partly in cash, partly in the king's goods. Some works were obtained by this stage very cheaply. For example, the artist John Baptiste Gaspers bought Van Dyck's Margaret Lemon that you see here for £23 and Veronese's Mars, Venus and Cupid for £11. The creditors drew up a second list and received 684 paintings in lieu of payment, and after some squabbling they divided them up and they were taken out of Somerset House by the cartload. They found that people like Charles I Taylor had jurors' self-portraits. These two portraits by Dürer, a self-portrait and portrait of an unknown man. Now, by this stage, the ambassador of France, Alonso de Cardenas, was not visible as a purchaser. Leopold William, the Archduke we mentioned earlier, was still absorbing all the works he'd bought from the Duke of Buckingham's collection and the Hamilton collection. Queen Christina of Sweden, another great collector, had just looted from a castle in Prague and made off with a collection of Rudolph II. Now, at this stage, Cardenas, who, as I said, was ambassador of France and hadn't participated, by this late stage, suddenly started to negotiate aggressively. For the people who own these paintings, it was too good to be true. He paid £325 for Tintoretto's Christ washing the feet of the apostles, which had been valued at £300, and he acquired two portraits by Dürer for £75 each from the king's tailor. In 1652, France entered the market, as I said, and Cardenas dominated the market at this point, and Cardinal Mazarin, as well, from France, decided to renew diplomatic relations with England and sent across an agent. And in 1653, the two ambassadors, Cardenas and Mazarin, fought to buy not literally, but bidding against each other to buy the remaining artworks. Bordeaux bought tapestries and thoroughbred horses earlier, but he started buying paintings, and perhaps the greatest masterpiece he bought was Raphael's The Holy Family, known as the Pearl, shown here. Then the Spanish ambassador led the way in the first stage of the sale and started buying on the secondary market. He bought this painting, originally valued at £3,000 for £2,600, and that was prior to the French ambassador entering the market. The quote from the French ambassador was, "The painting is well done, but so expensive that no one talks of buying it at this stage. It had been marked down to £2,500. Titian's St. Peter Enthroned and Pope Alexander X was valued at 250, but the Spanish ambassador said it was dark and melancholy and not a painting of taste." So it does seem as though he was able to judge between different quality Titians. One of the creditors was Balthazar Gerbier, if you remember that name. He ran away when the Civil War started and returned and was able to weasel his way into the affections of Cromwell's government, even though he'd been knighted by Charles. And he wrote a pamphlet condemning Charles. And he was given Emperor Charles V with Hound to pay off his debt of £150, and he sold it to Spain, and it's still in the Prado. Now, with this competition that I mentioned between Spain and France, sometimes overt, sometimes behind the scenes, prices started to jump, and as I said, the painting was described by the Spanish as done well, although very profane. It is much esteemed. So the problem for the Spanish purchaser of this painting by Correggio was that it was too profane for the Spanish, and so it was bought by Cardinal Mazarin, who wrote to his agent, in no case allow it to go to the Spanish ambassador, although I think by that stage the Spanish had decided that they wouldn't be buying it. But Cardinal Mazarin closed the deal. He bought this painting for a staggering £3,000. It was de Cardenas had paid only £400 for the pendant painting The Education of Cupid. Although with this painting it was a near thing, as de Cardenas tried to bribe the seller into putting it back on the market again. And we come to the Pardo Venus, which Hutchinson decided at this point, with an active market, to sell it for 8 times the price he paid. Prices, remember, had skyrocketed. People were paying top prices, the French and the Spanish. Remember, he paid £600 for this painting, but he was merciless in negotiating. He offered it to the French ambassador for £4,200. And a few days later, because the ambassador refused to buy it, he raised the price to £4,900 and sold it. There were also buyers behind the scenes operating in secret. There was a French banker, Jabach, whose name I mentioned earlier, but we don't know what price he paid or what he was buying. We know he came to London, and we know he was represented in London by a French merchant called Adam Corr. But we don't have the correspondence that we have for Mazarin and Bordeaux, so we don't know as much detail of the transactions that took place. Some important works, by the way, were reserved for the government, including Mantegna's Triumphs of Caesar and the Raphael cartoons of the Acts of the Apostles, which is why they're still in England. It was a peculiar rag bag. It included tapestries, portraits, Old Testament subjects. We don't know why the government chose these particular works. I mean, obviously, Mantegna's Triumphs of Caesar and Raphael's work were major works, but the other works that were retained, maybe they were had a particular place in some of the Paris palaces that were used to entertain foreign dignitaries, and they didn't want to leave the walls bare. So they kept whatever was hanging on the walls at the time. Well, in total, it was the largest art sale in history, and although many prices were depressed, it established essentially the first art market across Europe, and the active buying and selling created a precedent, and it made buying and selling of art in future, it simplified it, it established a precedent, and it made art more accessible to a wider group of wealthy individuals. Now briefly, we come to the 1660s and the restoration of Charles II. The day after he was restored as king, he called for an investigation of where the king's goods had got to. Lists were drawn up. Officials were empowered to seize any goods immediately. All exports were stopped, although it was too late for most of the sales. A system was introduced where anyone who reported someone else with the king's goods would receive 20% of their value. So they paid informers, which led to a lot of abuses. There was someone called Hawley who raided houses, dug up floors, took away personal possessions, things that had never been owned by the king. Eventually he had to return over 600 paintings and 203 statues. The bulk of the king's collection, though now some of those returned were copies, but he nevertheless became a rich man. Parliament passed a law saying anyone who'd obtained the royal goods illegally would forfeit them, and the person who gave them away, if you like, handed them in, would get a share of the profit. They were known as discoveries, and led, of course, to a lot of bad feeling, although in the end they raised very little money. Inigo Jones was a named person, and he had to pay some £21 for some paintings he owned as a fine. Staggeringly, £1,800 of royal plate was discovered, owned by Henry Mildmay, the former keeper of the royal jewels. Other people demanded money in back pay, like the keeper of the wardrobe demanded £7,000 in back pay. Many members of the former king's household claimed they'd engaged in heroic acts to save the king's goods, and many Republicans swore allegiance to the new king. That those that were involved directly in the beheading of Charles I were hung, drawn and quartered. No foreign monarchs systematically returned Charles I's art to Charles II. Some gave gifts voluntarily, some negotiated privately. The Dutch government offered the king gifts in compensation, including this painting and two others. And two are still the only genuine Titians in the royal collection. One of them, this one. Although it's not clear that Charles I ever owned these works, they were gifts that were offered, and the word used in the contract was offered rather than returned. So it suggests they were gifts offered, probably in return for some diplomatic favour. Not everyone returned the goods. So, as I said, Parliament passed a law offering a reward of 20% to informants. And Peter Lely, who'd lived in the King's Court overseas, registered 10 paintings and 4 statues, including this one, Crouching Venus, which is now in the British Museum. It's sometimes known as Lely's Venus after him, and it was acquired from the royal collection following the king's execution, and after Lely's own death it found its way back into the royal collection. Some people made a fortune from the Commonwealth Sale, but many never received the money they were owed by Charles I, and in some cases Charles II paid off these debts of his father. Finally, a remarkable story of how one major work was lost only to be found buried in someone's garden. Today it stands amid traffic to the south of Trafalgar Square, unnoticed by the majority of passers-by. It was the first Renaissance-style equestrian statue in England, commissioned by the Lord High Treasurer Richard Weston for his garden in his country house in Roehampton, Surrey, now South London. And following the English Civil War, the statue was sold to a metalsmith to be broken down. And the metalsmith actually sold cutlery that he alleged were made from the statue. However, he'd buried the statue in his garden and he kept it hidden until the restoration and then dug it up again. And it's now at this site. The site actually marks the official centre of London. It's the point from which all distances to London are measured. Charles I was the greatest of all royal collectors, but after his execution, as we've seen, the royal collection was sold to pay his debts, a complex and lengthy affair that was unsatisfactory in many ways. Some items were returned after the restoration of Charles II, but most of the artworks had been sold around Europe and were never returned. Thank you for your time and attention, and goodbye for now.